This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how to get results from working with owner relations departments. And this is a topic that is something that every royalty owner deals with at some point or another, Justin.
You nailed it, Matt. And unfortunately or fortunately, not all are created equal. But this is something that we shouldn't be afraid to work with the operators. And it really can make our lives a lot easier if they're willing to work with us and give us the information we need.
Yeah, and their job is to help you, and they're there to do that. And they're not trying to limit access or to create problems for you. But one of the things that I find many royalty owners don't understand is that you have to know what types of questions to ask in order to get the answer that you're looking for. Sometimes if you send an email or make a call in frustration, you don't have the full picture, you haven't sat down and done your homework and really understood the problem, then you're just going to be banging your head against the wall, so to speak. So this is what we want to prevent, you having to go through that process and not getting the results you want. So today we're going to give you our tips and tricks to get the most from your interactions with the owner relations department of your operator and or division order analyst. And you kind of put that under the bucket of all the different departments that you might work with to get the answer that you need. So, I think that's something that is probably much needed, because I know this is a question that comes up over and over when I look at our emails that we get and we look on the Mineral Rights Forum and other places like that.
I think it helps a lot when you understand what the division order analyst's job really is. And each company can be a little bit different in exactly how they function. But that owner relations is usually just a front door. That person going through that inbox might not even be the division order analyst you need to speak to. More likely than not, it's just an admin person who's responsible for sorting those emails and then sending them through to the proper people. And then, Matt, you've been in the industry. The proper people isn't always just a job title. That can be a job title in a certain area responsible for a certain type of ownership. And I think mineral owners can miss that. And it may be different from this company to that company.
That's a great point. I think it's very important to understand specifically how your operator is organized. And that really starts with looking at their website and the owner relations department. That'll tell you very specifically what is the phone number or email address that you should use for your problem, depending on what type of problem it is. And it really depends on the type of issue or the type of request that you're making. And routing it to the correct department will expedite your response. If you send it to the wrong department, it's going to sit out there for a long time, because then they have to forward it on. And so it goes to the back of the queue. They're working on things that they can knock out quickly. And if there's something that's ambiguous or was sent to the totally wrong department, then it's going to take longer for you to get the answer that you're looking for. So, I think this is one thing to think about. The owner relations is really the forward-facing group within the operator. It's not one person who does everything for you. It's the front line, right? They're the ones that route your request to the appropriate department. So think of them as like the customer service department. And then you have, if you have a technical question, they'll have the technical support group that they'll forward your request to. Or if you have a billing question, maybe they'll send it to the accounting department or the billing department. So it's the same thing. If you called your internet service provider or any other company, they have very similar frontline, people that will help with the triage type of things, the very quick and easy requests. And then if it's a more complicated request, they'll route it to the right department. And so I think looking at a couple of specific examples will help illustrate this point. So, for example, ExxonMobil is organized by several different teams, 3 specific teams. One is revenue department that handles the checks, the production, the pricing, deductions, well status. Of course, division order and lease group handles the ownership transfers, your questions on your decimal interest in a well. If you have a death and you need to transfer and find out what needs to be done to, give them the right documentation to put you in pay status. If you have an address change, tax forms, if you have a question about your lease, you feel like it's not interpreted correctly, you're getting post-production deductions when you shouldn't be, et cetera, those types of things. And then finally, there's the joint interest billing, which, as you can expect, that's a totally separate side of things. That's the working interest side. And they deal with invoices, that's the joint interest billing, the JIB statements that they send to their non-operated working interest partners, and the revenue side of that as well. So that's kind of if you think about it, the minerals is those first 2, and then the operated and the leasehold side of things is that joint interest billing group. ConocoPhillips is another one that does something similar. And again, they'll put all this information on their website and it make it very clear which phone number you need to call or which email you need to use for your request. And I think I would categorize most of the requests that we have as mineral and royalty owners fall into 4 buckets. The first is around revenue and payment, right? So you have a missing check, for example, or there's a post-production deduction that just popped up and you don't think it should be, or there's a price or a volume question, or a statement that has some prior period adjustments that don't make sense. Those types of questions go to that revenue and payment category. And that's often routed to a specific group. The next one I would say is under the ownership and title side of things. So that's where you have a division order that you got and you have a question about it. Maybe there's a wrong decimal. Maybe the well just traded hands, different operator just bought it and they sent you the division order, but the decimal interest is wrong. If you have an entity change, maybe you set up an LLC or a trust and you just conveyed the minerals into that entity, you need to make a change of address. Or if you're in suspense and there's a title requirement, they need some documentation from you. That's the group that would need to be you'd need to be interacting with. And those are often the ones that will interface with the land department, or maybe even be part of the land department within that company. And then the next one I would say is more in the accounting and the tax side of things. And this gets into like going into their accounting system, making that change of address, the direct deposit situation, if you want to set that up, ACH, if they're missing a 1099 or a 1099 is incorrect. And then, access to things like Energy Link, right? Some of them will have a portal that you can access your revenue statements through Energy Link or another system like that. And then, like we mentioned, lastly, the last one is the working interest billing. And that's, again, if you're a working interest owner, which we're really not going to focus on today because, again, being a mineral and royalty owner, we're really focused on dealing with that side of things. But, I think it's really important to understand, Justin, because I see a lot of times where people will just say, hey, this is wrong, please correct it. And then, they realize they're wondering why they don't get a response, right? So this is something that is important to understand, this type of division of labor, so to speak.
There's some fundamental information you really have to give them at so they can get you the right person. And it may be funny, but it's not a joke that an entire email to the royalty department, I'm sure they receive many that says, please fix my check. And though they may want to help you, they have no ability to get you to the person who can help you. So Matt, I really think that's important. That information that they need really can vary based on the company and how they split those departments up. So starting on their owner relations website, taking a minute to understand what they're asking you to do is important. And then Matt, how do we communicate that information to them? I think that's an important thing. And I think people that have been doing this a long time have realized, hey, here's the information we need in this always, every time. And this will help speed things along depending on the type of question that it is.
Yeah, think of this as like your cheat sheet for working with the operator. And every time you interact with the operator, no matter what the issue, you're going to need to give them your name or the entity name exactly as it appears in their records, your owner number, if you have that, your mailing address, or at least the one that's in their system, a phone number where they can call you back. And then if the interest is in the trust, an LLC, an estate, use that exact legal name. And then you have to be very clear what your relationship is to that estate. For example, if you're the executor of your mother's estate and you're interacting on behalf of her estate, then you need to be very clear about that and provide documentation. They won't just take your word for it because they want to make sure they're paying the right person and interacting with the right person. And so that you'll need to dig up those, the letters, testamentary and things like that you got from that estate, and have the copies of that you could provide to the operator so they know that when they're interacting with you, you're authorized to act on behalf of that entity. The next thing you need to do after you've clearly stated who you are in way that they can quickly look it up in their system and identify and match your interest to you, the next thing you have to do is identify the property you're talking about, because maybe if you have interest in multiple wells, but only one of those wells is where you have the question, you want to be very specific about the fact that this lease or this property number based on that property number that's on your revenue statement. And then if you know things that are like the API number of the well or other things like that, you can always provide that as well as the well name. But the other thing that you'll find is having a legal description of your property is an important thing to provide if there's a question about, you have an interest in a well or not, or if you think your interest is incorrect. It's very helpful to provide the full legal description of the property in question in terms of, the section, township, range, the full legal description, the county, state, etc., and then describing the well that you're talking about and have a question about or an issue with. And any of the documentation, if it's related to a request related to your ownership in that, you're going to need to provide documentation to substantiate your request. And that means copies of recorded deeds or recorded assignment documents and things like that. So that would be, I guess, if you have like an ownership question or decimal interest question, those are the types of things. And then further to that, let's say that you have a question about a specific payment. So you provided your information, you provided the property information in your tract or whatever that you're talking about. And then you can talk about, okay, I have a question about a payment that is, specifically the volume, it looks incorrect, or, whatever it is. And why was this is what was reported to the Texas Railroad Commission, for example, but this volume shows up on the check. Please explain why this is lower, or whatever the issue is that you're asking about. And that is something you need to request information based on a check date, a payment number, a month and product, or exact line item that you're questioning, if it's a deduction or something like that. And all of this, if you can think about it, this takes some time to prepare this very specific email, to the owner relations department. But by doing that, you're going to get a much quicker response because they can very quickly look at the information for your account and then provide an answer for it if it's a fairly straightforward request, versus if it's ambiguous, they have to sit and think, okay, well, I'm not even sure which property they're talking about. I'm going to have to send them an email to say, hey, you need to provide this information. So you're shortcutting that whole interaction by providing them all the information up front. And I would say more is better. If you're not sure exactly what you need, the more you can explain and describe the problem and your relationship to that interest, the better.
You have a method to the madness, Matt, and looking at it in 4 passes is something that I think is a really great idea. And you can help yourself along. And pass 1 is identity. Are you sure you're looking at the right owner account? Property, well, sales month. Very often you can end up with 2 owner numbers, Matt. And so that can happen because maybe you have a slight change in an entity name. Maybe 2 accounts were created because one entity name is abbreviated and one is spelled out fully. So this can happen. If you think you might have 2 owner numbers, it's absolutely worth mentioning in the email. That way, as they look this up, they have reference to that other one and they can see this issue as well and help you to get that corrected. Pass 2 is status. Is the account in pay status? Is it a below the minimum payment threshold status? In suspense? Knowing if that well is producing, if it's been shut in, When was the last time there was production? No check can mean lots of different things, Matt. And so being as specific as possible really can help. And then 3, calculation. If a check changed, isolate exactly what changed. Compare the same property, product, sales month, reference what check you looked at that did not have the change previously, and then what check you looked at that did have the change so that they can follow the error just like you did. And then pass 4, be authority. Who actually has the records and the power to answer the question for you? It may be a revenue department question. It could be a land and ownership question. It could also be a tax question. That's not the operator at all. It may need to go to the county assessor or something else in that area. So it's worth looking at exactly what you're trying to answer and who's likely to give you that answer for the organization.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to highlight here is that if you have a check that you didn't get for a month, have you done the research to understand the status of that well? Because you can save yourself the time of even having to contact the operator. If you look at, for example, the Railroad Commission website or the State Oil and Gas Commission website, and you see that the well is shut in and that it hasn't reported any production for that month. And sometimes you may need to wait a month or two after that production month before it shows up in this the state level and the data there. But that can be something you can help yourself very quickly just by understanding how to find information on your well and look at the status and look at the production on the State Oil and Gas Commission website to see, oh, okay, I didn't get a check for that well. I didn't get payment for that well last month. It's not that they forgot it, it's the well shut in. And then you can ask a very specific or different question rather than the fact is, why didn't I get a check? Well, now you know why you didn't get a check. It's because the well was shut in. The question you can ask is, why is that well shut in and when will it be restored to production? Right? So you can help yourself get more specific, helpful answers to your questions by doing a little bit of research and knowing how to manage and to navigate those State Oil and Gas Commission websites. If you need help and step-by-step instruction on that, I have that in my Mineral Management Basics course where I teach you the different types of interests, how to perform a title search, and then how to research your property on the State Oil and Gas Commission website to answer questions like this. And then also how to find missing royalties that may have been escheated to the state. So you can find more about that at mineralrightspodcast.com/courses. But Justin, I think that's really important to be a knowledgeable royalty owner so that when you ask the questions that you come from a position of knowledge and polite, requests that are very specific and easily answerable by the operator. The more ambiguous you are, the less chance that you're going to get the answer you're looking for.
I think you nailed it, Matt. And having a conversation with an expert in your group that you trust or have relied on for your properties or for oil and gas knowledge is a great place to start if you're really uncomfortable interacting with the owner. That can be a great way to get an idea of exactly what it is you should be asking and how you should be asking it. And then don't be afraid to ask questions. In my experience, the division order analysts are there to help you, but they don't want to have to extract the information because, again, there's very certain information they need to be able to help you. So you want to be informed and go into that with that. Matt, I think another thing is in the wild, this can kind of work out several different ways. I think there's a lot of assumptions for how the operator should work. And so some people have a good experience where they're able to get to a division order analyst or the right person to get their question answered. And then there's the opposite where, it's a very slow moving process. Maybe something happened and you're trying to get it straightened out. And when you start to get frustrated, you lose sight of what it is you're trying to accomplish. You want to be organized. You want to pass the information. You want to keep up with when you sent those requests and follow up on those requests. And quite often, Matt, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
That's a key point there. I think the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And, like you always say, Justin, polite persistence pays. And if you haven't heard back, in a timely manner, don't just wait. You can send another request. You can compile that information together that we just went through. That again includes all the relevant information about your account, the entity, the specific check, or the specific question that you have, and send it again. I think that, maybe it got missed. Maybe that person it went into the back of the queue, and going to the right person the next time, you'll get a faster response. It is human nature that, and thankfully right now we have humans that are responding to this, but at some point it'll probably all just be AI. But until then, I think that it's important to, maybe reread your original request. Look at, was it very clearly worded or was it ambiguous? Maybe think about rewording it a certain way and be more specific about the type of question that you have. And you might get a quicker answer. But again, I think just silence and just hoping for the best is not a great strategy here, because oftentimes they get so many requests that sometimes things can get lost. I mean, it's very much a fact of life, particularly if your request is ambiguous and wasn't really clear, and it got sent to the wrong department, and then they sat on it because they can't do anything. They don't know how to answer the question you asked based on the information or their authority. So you need to be very specific, and again, maybe send another email if you're not getting the response, or try a different channel, right? So I think that's the other thing that let's talk about. If you don't get a response one way, what are some different things you can do, Justin, to hopefully get through that wall?
And Matt, I think this is where it can get really state specific on what rights you really have and what is the right way to handle it. But within a reasonable amount of time, this is something that you certainly shouldn't go straight for the nuclear option in this scenario. But when you're reaching out to the operators, continue to follow up with them. And when it reaches a point that you haven't heard back or you feel like it's unreasonable, it's really time to get legal advice, even if it's just talking with an attorney to understand how your state handles officially filing a notice to the operator. Texas is pretty standardized at this point. It's something that they have done this way for quite a while. And the Texas Natural Resource Code, Chapter 91, it gives royalty owners specific information and notice rights. So the Railroad Commissioner's own summary explains that a written notice claiming a failure to make timely payment requires a payer to pay or respond in writing within 30 days of receiving that notice. It also explains a certified mail request for itemized deductions, adjustment, gas, heating value, or the commission's identification number must be answered within 60 days. And there's other timeframes, Matt, and other states handle this a bit differently, but there's usually these parameters where you can give them an official notification that may have a specific method of doing so. And that starts a clock ticking to really reserve your rights. And again, the place to start there is with an attorney in that area that would know those deadlines and know what needs to happen to officially do that, even if you send that certified letter on your own.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And sometimes you could do these things in parallel. So you could send the email, knowing that an email asking for help or making a claim or a request is not the same as giving notice under statute. And you have to read that statute to understand specifically what you need to do. And most of them will require a certified mail request. So it means you'd have to print out that letter and send it with the documentation to the address that's listed on the Owner Relations Department website. By doing that, you're giving official notice, and then the clock starts ticking. And to help expedite it, maybe you'll get the answer in a quicker manner if you email them at the same time. But just know that you have to do some very specific things in order to take advantage of those rights that are given to you under statute, because they have very specific methods that you must give notice, and you have to be using one of those methods in order for that statute to apply. So again, knowing that in your specific state is very important. You can just, if you're not sure, you can Google oil and gas royalty payment statute, and then whatever state it is, and then find a link to the full statute itself, and you can read it and see what you need to do. So episode 334, we talked about how to use AI to turn your old deeds into a mineral rights inventory. But using those same tools, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, you can actually use that to help you get information, right? So if you can't really understand the way that state statute is worded, you can make a copy of all of that, run it through AI, get it to explain it to you in plain English, so to speak, and help you understand what you need to do. And obviously, none of this should substitute getting help from a qualified advisor like a CPA, an attorney, or financial advisor. But this can help you kind of understand what your rights are, and then help you when you have the conversation with your attorney. If you are going down that legal route and need to be making official notice and understanding your rights, then maybe that's where you need to have a conversation with an attorney. But at least you can have working knowledge with the statute before that conversation. And then similarly, AI is great at writing letters. If you can explain, use the information we talk about today and run that through AI and have it create a form email for you, you can use that, save that email, and then anytime you have a request, it's got your owner number on there, it's got your information that you need to provide, and then again, you can just change the request or even have it help write a draft to start with to ask for the very specific thing that you need, and that can be a really good way to use AI. Again, you still have to go through and do some proofreading and make some changes and make sure that it actually is doing what you want it to do, but that can be a good way to get started if you're not really sure where to start.
I think that's great advice, Matt. It is really good at helping to pull that together, especially when it's a technical topic like this. And I think it'd be worth it, Matt. Let's do an example, because this is something, we get bits and pieces of questions of this process. But if somebody's never gone through this, it can be hard to understand what the steps are and what exactly you're doing. So let's say Maria owns a royalty interest in Texas gas well. Her April statement shows an unfamiliar compression deduction and a negative adjustment. Her total payment is well below the previous month's payment. Her first instinct is to fire off, hey, you owe me money. This isn't right. But that is likely to get a really slow response, if a response at all. And so her best option is to pull together the account identification, which is the owner name, owner number, property number, county, sales month, payment date. Second, there could be several causes. She realizes that going into this, she's asking a question about why is it this way, not you owe me something, looking for the explanation. And we're trying to do it politely. Like you said, Matt, polite persistence. So it's okay to ask this question. You want to know what's wrong with your check. However, we don't want to be accusatory. It's not their fault. It's certainly not their money. So they're there to answer the questions. And third, be sure and check the operator's website. We understand how we're going to route that question. If it's a revenue question, an ownership question, a land question, and then ask one narrow question. This month's check was this amount. The next month's check was this amount. I see that there's a new compression charge. Can you explain to me why that this happened? And Matt, I think that if most people handled it in that way, would get likely get a response from the operator, because they can get it to the right person to answer the right question for the right person.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the other thing to do is make note of when you first contacted the operator. And if you haven't gotten a response after a certain period of time, set a follow-up date, set a reminder in your phone to follow up maybe within 2 weeks, if you haven't heard anything back by then. And that just helps you stay on top of it. The other thing is, in this case, the scenario with Maria, she has an unfamiliar deduction that popped up and a negative adjustment. Maybe that's incorrect. You have to really understand your rights, understand your lease to know whether or not they can actually legally deduct that as a post-production deduction. For example, if her lease had cost-free royalty language, in other words, that it specifically prohibited the deduction of any post-production cost, then she would have a real case, I think, to fight that, particularly if it had been interpreted in one way and she had not been getting those deductions, and then all of a sudden that popped up. Again, knowing that and knowing what your rights are under the lease, if you get royalties and you have a question about the amount and the deductions and things like that, you really need to have a copy of your lease to understand what your rights are, because that is the contract between you and the operator that dictates what they can and can't do. Now, of course, the state statute will also chime in if the lease is silent on a particular issue. But if you have very specific language in your lease and you feel like the operator's not following that, you really need to have working knowledge of your lease and understand what that language allows and what it doesn't allow. But let's say, okay, Maria does all those things we just talked about. And Justin, what happens if she doesn't get anywhere, right? She still doesn't get the answer that she's looking for. What are her next steps, or what are some different options that she might have?
So this being Texas specific, we can give a Texas specific example. So let's say this still goes nowhere. As an owner, you have a real decision to make. Does this rise to the level, or does it have the return on investment and value worth going the route of a Texas certified mail request for an itemized deduction and adjustment? Obviously, there's a requirement there under Chapter 91 of the Texas Natural Resource Code, and it comes with real timelines that the operator will be fully aware of. Because that carries legal weight, You have to check that current statute. You have to talk with an attorney and then decide if something formal is really what you want to do. And if the accounting gets explained, but the real disagreement turns out to be whether the lease even permits that kind of deduction in the first place, Matt, then that's really not an owner relations question anymore. This is where you're going to have to work with an attorney and they have to interpret your lease and make an opinion of their own and then see if they agree with the operator, with what they're saying about title or what remedies you may have to do to fix that confusion or make that clearer. And it's really a whole skill in knowing what to do and when to do it, and doing this based on what kind of claim you have, how much that claim is worth, and not doing it based on an emotional trigger of how frustrated you feel that they're not getting back to you can really be the hard part of doing this. That is easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if there's a lot of money at stake, you can feel very frustrated that they're, have you in suspense and they're not paying you, and you really want to get it taken care of quickly. And all of that's very understandable. But I think this is a good spot to kind of recap and give you some actions. If you are working on an issue with owner relations, the next time this comes up, let's challenge you to try these steps and see how it works. And if it, give us feedback, let us know how it went for you and following these steps and getting help from your operator. And just send us an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. I'm always curious to see how people are implementing this and what kind of results they're getting. But, first steps, I think, again, when you run into an issue and you need to contact the operator, number one is to classify the type of issue. Again, is it a revenue issue? In other words, your royalty statement, a payment issue? Is it an ownership or title issue? In other words, the decimal interest in your well, or whether you're getting paid on something or not, or you have a change of ownership type of a question. The next thing is administration. So that would kind of fall into, let's say, the other, everything else. Sometimes that gets into like the ACH or direct deposit type of a question, or tax, right? Maybe they don't have your W-9 on form and they're subtracting backup withholding and you need to get that corrected. Could be in that administration type of category. But again, just depends on the operator. Look at their website, find out if there are specific email addresses or phone numbers for these different things. Find the right one and make sure you're contacting the right group to start with. Number two, make sure that you let them know exactly who you are and why you have the authority to be asking about this question. So that would be your owner name, owner number, the property, county, the well or lease number, or their property number, per the revenue statement or your division order, payment date or in question, if that's a payment question, sales month, and then the exact, payment line item. If you have a question about some deduction or something like that, be very specific. Justin, what's next? What should you do next after letting them know who you are, what the issue is specifically, and then what's next?
Be sure you're sending it to the right place. Look at the owner relations website. Try to understand what type of question is this. Like we mentioned in step one, was this revenue, ownership, title, administration? And then ensure to send only what's necessary. Try not to communicate redacted or information that should be redacted, social security numbers, and then ask for confirmation of receipt and a case number. So many times when you email owner relations, if that's what you're doing, you'll get an automated email back, but then it can take some time to get through the queue before you actually hear back from whoever they've forwarded this to that can answer your question. But it's great to look at this every week, every 2 weeks, and you can send follow-up emails to see where you're at, especially once you've established the contact with that person. You're not the only person asking them questions. So again, polite persistence pays, and sometimes you have to be the squeaky wheel.
Yeah, and I would say another thing, that this is probably the most important thing of all, is to try to limit your request to a few specific issues at a time. That'll help them guide your response to that particular question to the right department. If you have 6 different things you're asking about, one of them's title related, one's revenue, one's administrative, it's going to really muddy the waters, so to speak. So I would be very specific and kind of prioritize what things you need to help with first, and then try to get those addressed, and then work on the next thing after that, or send a separate message. So, one primary issue, or maybe one another related primary issue. If there's something in the, say, both in the revenue or payment type of a question, you could kind of group those together. or if there's an ownership and title, one or two type of issues related to ownership and title, send those together. But the most important thing is to write in a very objective way. Okay, what I observed in my latest royalty statement is we have a post-production deduction that is just come up for the first time, and it's related to X. And we believe that this should not be deducted from our check because our lease does not allow post-production deductions. And here's a copy of our lease. Please advise why this was subtracted from our revenue statement. Or, ask them specifically what you want, right? You have to be very clear. Just stating the problem without asking for what you're asking for them to do can also sort of slow things down. So if you say, we did not receive payments for these months, and there's been no change of ownership. There's no reason. It looks like the well is in production still. Please confirm that we are still in pay status. Pay us these past due royalties and any interest that we may be owed because of the late payment. If they're past the statutory deadline, for example, to make payment on those interests. And you're making a very specific request, and it's a very, it's based on what that seems to be factual. You're not again, accusing them of doing anything. It's just, you need to pay us and you need to pay us interest. Please do that as soon as possible and advise if there's an issue so we can get it resolved. So again, being very professional, polite, being persistent will help you get the answers I think that you're looking for versus in the endless do loop in dealing with the owner relations department. Justin, anything else that you can think of before we wrap up? What are some of the things that you've found to be helpful in working with operators?
I think something that people don't realize is when you own minerals and you're looking to manage them and everyone thinks, oh, passive income. No, there's a level of management to owning minerals. And so you have really two distinct choices to make. You can either educate yourself, and there's several different ways to do that. Matt, you've put together a mineral management basic course that you can take. There's a National Association of Royalty Owners that provides education. There's lots of different ways to get the education. But if you're not going to educate yourself, then you have to build a team of experts and rely on them. And I think both routes here are very applicable. But if you're going to go the route of not understanding yourself, you've really got to get in touch with an expert, understand what it is you should be asking, or even have them, have this interaction with the operator, or at minimum, tell you what you should be asking and how to ask it. I think so often owners can go in and they just don't know what they don't know, but an operator could be very put off from that if you're asking something that's very clearly not something they can do or not the way that it works. And I do think there are mineral owners who end up in that black void due to that, where if they would have had a conversation with an expert, or they were working with somebody, then it would have been money well spent up front, or even a free consultation could have answered many questions.
Yeah, that's great advice. And, certainly if you're looking for help from an expert, the National Association of Royalty Owners is a great place to start. They have a business supporter directory that companies that have chosen to support Narrow and are in the business of helping mineral and royalty owners are listed there. So there's royalty audit companies, there are appraisers and engineers, there's attorneys, et cetera. So that's a great place to look for some help if you don't really even know where to start. And again, I think another note, I think you really do want to look at building that team of experts if you have interests that are, paying you a material amount of royalties. And when I mean material, it means that's a material amount for you, and that it would make financial sense to hire, someone to help you with it to make sure you're getting paid correctly. If you only get $50 a year, I know it. We always say to contact an attorney, get help from an expert. At some point you probably are going to eat up, any sort of revenue that you would get from that interest from hiring somebody. So there's that balancing act. You have to, use judgment based on your experience. Maybe you can get help from somebody that can do it on a free consultation basis if it's a very straightforward, quick question, or maybe you can ask somebody as part of one of those interactions as far as being a member of Narrow or something like that. You can get some help, high level general help, I would say, not legal help per se, but, participating in those discussions, getting your questions answered can help lead you in the right direction if you're, out there looking for help from those qualified experts. But Again, if you have a question you come up with, you're dealing with your operator, and you want to have a question answered on a future episode, you can send us an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, and we'll answer your question on the air as well. So hopefully this is helpful. And again, you can find the links to the resources we talked about today, past episodes, as well as other links in the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. So thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.